Now, the Fed was created against lots of skepticism. The majority in Congress was really against it, so they used the trick. They did it just before Christmas when nobody was there. It was the voting on it in December, 23rd of December, 1913. It was very badly attended just by the ones that knew about it and were voting in favor. But the main promise to persuade even those that it's a good thing was, well, if you have a run on a bank, even the best bank, the strongest bank, will fail if you don't have a mechanism to step in and help the bank. And if we
Right.
have a Federal Reserve, then that's the mechanism. That was the promise. Now, this is actually true that if there's a run for some reason, some panic created with some false rumors, it can bring down a bank if there is no mechanism. But when this happened,
If you have a mechanism that's starting the runs, it's a different kettle of fish.
exactly, precisely. Now, in the 1930s, what happened was more than 10,000 banks in America went bust. These were the many small local banks. And what did the Federal Reserve do?
Nothing.
Nothing. And again, last year in March, Silicon Valley Bank and a few other banks, they went under. What did the Federal Reserve do? It was the biggest run ever on one single bank on Silicon Valley on that day, $41 billion taken out through the FedNow system. So the bank couldn't even stop it anymore. They piloted with the Fed. So the money was carried out through the Fed system. Did the Fed step in? No, not before it was closed down.
One of the largest owners of the New York Fed and one of the most active agents for depository for the U.S. government was in fact on the other side. They were helping them go down. They were poaching them and they were exploiting the whole situation.
Exactly. I mean,
Doing quite the opposite.
Precisely. So the whole thing, I mean, if you look at the details, it looks extremely orchestrated. But again, that's been the record of the Federal Reserve. So the promise was, oh, you need a Fed, then you can step in when there are runs on banks. Well, they didn't step in the 1930s, and that's how the face of America was changed dramatically in the 1930s. And you mustn't forget that at the same time in the Soviet Union, they were doing the collectivization. Farmers' land was stolen, was taken by the government, and they created these huge coal shows, agro combines. Well, actually, the same thing was done in the US through the banking system, through the Federal Reserve, because what happened was that 10,000 small local banks, farmers' banks that had lent to local farmers, were bankrupted. The Fed did nothing to step in. And these banks were then gobbled up by big banks that were part of the Fed system with the Fed backing. Now, were the borrowers from these banks let off? No. The depositors lost all their money, but the farmers had to still repay their loans. And of course, they couldn't because they just crashed
It was
the
a
economy.
huge land grab. It was
Absolutely.
an engineered land grab.
Absolutely. And as a result, there was literally starvation. I mean, they hit the farmers.
Right.
Farmers were suddenly expropriated. They lost their land. And they had no more job. They had no more way to feed themselves or feed America. There was literally starvation. Just read John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath, for some very accurate details.
When you have lots of small banks and they know their economy, the more loans they make to productive activity, and again, only imagination ultimately limits productive activity, the more growth you get that can be environmentally not damaging and can be good for everybody. So you're talking about prosperity.
Exactly.
So you have a engine to create prosperity on a decentralized basis. And it is intentionally shut down in a way that central powers can grab the land.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
This is what happened in the 30s. And this is one of the things it's so important to me to prevent from happening again, because it looks like all the forces are arraying to, they're working up to a couple things, but one of which is a land grab. And so it's so important to understand this point that there is a prosperity engine. There's no economic problem. There's a prosperity engine, and somebody's shutting it down so they can do a land grab. And that prosperity engine must be protected at all costs.
Exactly.
And there's no reason to think that it can't be highly successful economically.
Exactly.
And I just want to make one point. When interest rates were coming down, the bank regulation hitting the community banks in America was forcing them to put everything into their investment portfolio and stopping them from making loans on Main Street, which are the engine of prosperity. Well, but there was another part of this dynamic, Richard, and that was as the interest rates came down, of course, the government borrowed more and more, putting everybody in the debt trap. But then the government would subsidize massive amounts of activities locally, getting more and more of the economy dependent on federal subsidy. And
Yes.
so you're shutting off the private entrepreneurial activity and re-engineering the entire local economy into a not just a debt trap, but a government subsidy trap.
Yes. So centralization has been the goal, and it's yeah, centralization, takeover of land and farmers and farms, and that's been essentially what the central planners in the background have been aiming at.